A quiet summer day in Ohio turns eerie when a mother and her young son are caught in a moment that will change their lives forever. Shadows creep across a sunny parking lot, and the ordinary becomes unforgettable. The sun had barely reached its peak, casting a golden haze over North Olmstead, Ohio. Birds sang lazily from power lines, and the quiet hum of early summer filled the air. On any other day, the giant Eagle grocery store parking lot would have been a scene of ordinary life. Parents unloading shopping carts, children chasing one another, strangers offering polite nods. Life felt safe, normal, unremarkable, until it wasn't. Margot would push the cart slowly along the lot, her 3-year-old son Julian perched precariously on the edge. His laughter rang bright and pure, a fragile soundtrack against the mundane buzz of summer errands. Margot's eyes followed him constantly, instinctual and protective. She had no inkling that, within minutes, her world would shatter in a way no parent could ever prepare for. In the shadows of the lot, something moved that did not belong. Bianca Ellis, 32, walked with an eerie stillness, the weight of her intentions hidden behind blank eyes. Her fingers wrapped around the handle of a 12-inch butcher knife, concealed yet deadly. She had walked this earth before, tangled in invisible battles with a mind that refused to stay tethered to reality. Police files and psychiatric notes were scattered across departments, a silent testimony to warnings that went unheeded. No one noticed her approach, not yet. Julian squealed as he leaned toward a rogue leaf fluttering across the asphalt. Margot bent down to grab him, her hand brushing his soft cheek. That touch, that fleeting moment of innocence, was about to be severed by a blade, by chaos, by something incomprehensible. A sudden scream tore through the air, sharp and raw. Shoppers turned, eyes wide, hearts racing. Margot stumbled back, horror flashing across her face as Bianca struck without hesitation. The blade slashed through the air, aimed not at objects, but at human flesh. Julian shrieked, his small body trying to escape. Time slowed. Every movement became grotesquely magnified. A mother reaching for her child, a child screaming for his mother, the knife glinting in sunlight. The world outside this parking lot ceased to exist for anyone who bore witness. Panic erupted, a wave crashing against stunned bystanders who could barely comprehend what was unfolding. By the time security and local law enforcement arrived, chaos had already carved its mark into the day. Julian lay motionless, a small, fragile life extinguished too soon. Margot's cries pierced through the lot, reverberating off walls and vehicles alike, a sound heavy with grief and disbelief. Neighbors and witnesses would later describe Bianca's eyes as vacant, hollow, unseeing. She seemed detached, yet deliberate, as if the world around her existed in fragments only she could navigate. Questions poured in, unanswerable and sharp. Why him? Why here? How could a single life be so violently interrupted for no reason at all? The community felt the weight immediately. Streets outside the store were lined with police cars, flashing red and blue, their lights painting the lot in an unnatural twilight. Reporters arrived, cameras rolling, capturing the unspeakable on film. Families held children closer. Friends called each other frantically. A summer day had turned into a nightmare etched into memory. As investigators combed through security footage and witness statements, a deeper picture emerged. Bianca Ellis was not a stranger to danger. Mental health records, prior police calls, neighborhood complaints all pointed to instability, a pattern that no one had been able to contain. Yet, questions remained. Why had she snapped at that exact moment, in that exact place? And why had the system, in all its protocols, failed to prevent this? In the midst of public outrage and private mourning, Margot Wood became a symbol of unbearable loss. Friends described her as gentle, steadfast, a mother whose life revolved around her child. Julian was the light of her world, a 3-year-old old with an uncontainable curiosity, unaware that his laughter would be silenced in an instant. Authorities worked tirelessly, piecing together the minutes before the attack. Footage showed Bianca entering the lot calmly, almost methodically. She passed other shoppers without incident. She did not speak. She did not hesitate. And yet, something invisible seemed to guide her toward Julian and Margot, a targeting that would haunt investigators for weeks. Neighbors recalled seeing Bianca in public, wandering aimlessly at times, muttering to herself. Mental health professionals had warned of her unpredictable behavior. Police reports hinted at domestic disturbances, erratic threats, and hospitalizations. But on that June day, the warnings had failed to intersect with fate. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the asphalt, the story of Julian Wood became a collective wound. Social media exploded with condolences, anger, and confusion. Experts debated the failures of mental health interventions. Families questioned the safety of everyday spaces. And somewhere, within the sterile confines of a police precinct, Bianca Ellis sat quietly, charged and remorseless, a storm contained only by steel bars. The lot itself remained a haunting relic of violence. Carts abandoned, footprints pressed into the asphalt, stains that could never be erased. For Margot, for the community, for a nation watching from afar, the question lingered: could something this senseless ever be understood, ever be forgiven? And as night fell over North Olmstead, the investigation had only just begun. The pieces of this horrifying puzzle were scattered, some deliberately hidden, some invisible until the patient hands of law enforcement could uncover them. But one thing was certain: the life of 3-year old Julian Wood had ended far too soon, and the shadow of that day would linger long after the sun rose again. The discovery that would shake the case to its core was yet to come, a twist buried beneath layers of history, mental illness, and the human failures that had allowed tragedy to strike. Bianca Ellis was only the beginning of a story that would force a community to confront questions about justice, accountability, and the dark edges of the human mind. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of the lot, a single question waited to be answered: how could anyone survive this nightmare unscarred? The sun had barely risen the next morning, but North Olmstead was already awake with a different rhythm. The streets felt heavier, every passer-by carrying the weight of what had happened. Investigators retraced steps, interviewed witnesses, and combed through surveillance footage again and again, as if repetition could somehow rewind time. Margot Wood could not sleep. Every creak of her apartment reminded her of Julian's laughter, now absent. She clutched his favorite stuffed toy, as though holding it tight could summon him back. Her grief was raw, unrelenting, a burning presence that refused to fade. Friends urged her to rest, to breathe, to eat. She tried, but the image of Julian running toward that fleeting summer leaf haunted her like a shadow she could never shake. Meanwhile, in the sterile, fluorescent, lit interrogation room, Bianca Ellis sat alone. Her expression was blank, unreadable. She offered no explanation, no emotion, only silence. The knife had been recovered, still slick from the act. Investigators studied her history, looking for a motive, any shred of reasoning that could explain the inexplicable. Hospital records, police reports, neighbors' accounts all painted a fragmented picture of a mind untethered, a life spiraling toward this violent intersection with innocence. New evidence emerged almost immediately. Security footage revealed a chilling detail. Bianca had paused near several shoppers, almost studying them. There were no verbal interactions, no signs of panic, yet something about her movements suggested calculation. The randomness of her choice became less random with each frame. Julian had been singled out, a tiny target in a vast, ordinary parking lot. The thought made detectives' stomachs turn. Detectives found patterns in her past. Hospital admissions for schizophrenia, repeated confrontations with law enforcement, calls from neighbors reporting erratic behavior. The system had seen the warning signs, yet they had failed. Officers muttered about bureaucratic red tape, about mental health services stretched thin. Each report became a reminder that tragedy often grows in the gaps where society fails to act. Margot was called in to provide a victim statement. She struggled to form words, the grief pressing against her throat. She could barely describe Julian's smile, the tilt of his head when he laughed, the way he held her finger as they crossed the parking lot. Police scribbled furiously, but Margot's mind wandered, remembering the moment everything turned to chaos. The knife flashing, the screams, the desperate attempt to shield her child. The memory was a wound that refused to scab over. As the investigation deepened, another unsettling discovery came to light. Bianca's social media and journal entries hinted at a disconnection from reality, but also flashes of disturbing intent. References to being invisible, to acting on impulses, to punishing a world that she believed had wronged her, all painted a portrait of a mind teetering on the edge. Experts debated whether this was premeditation or pure delusion. The distinction felt almost irrelevant to the parents and families shattered in the aftermath. Detectives began interviewing other shoppers present that day. Accounts were inconsistent, contradictory, fragmented by fear and chaos. One woman remembered seeing Bianca smile faintly before the attack. Another described her movements as mechanical, almost as if she were watching herself from outside her body. Each statement layered another mystery onto the case, deepening the complexity, making it impossible to untangle motive from madness. Then came the shocking revelation. Bianca had recently been released from a psychiatric hold, just weeks before the attack. Documents suggested she was deemed stable enough to return to the community. Her medications had been adjusted, appointments scheduled, and yet something in her mind remained volatile, unpredictable. The public outcry was immediate. How could a person with this history be allowed back into society without stricter monitoring? Questions of negligence, bureaucracy, and accountability burned through local media, leaving a community desperate for answers. Margot's family wrestled with their own dark spiral. Anger collided with grief, creating storms of frustration and despair. Relatives demanded justice, not just for Julian, but for the failings that allowed this tragedy to occur. Every investigation update was consumed with anxious urgency. Social media feeds were flooded with questions and accusations. The shadow of the attack stretched far beyond the parking lot, touching lives that had once felt safe in Ohio's quiet streets. Meanwhile, forensic teams uncovered a chilling detail about the knife. It bore fingerprints not only from Bianca, but traces of previous handling, suggesting she had prepared for this, consciously or unconsciously. A psychological profile emerged, painting her as a person consumed by fragmented realities, who saw the world through lenses warped by schizophrenia and untreated trauma. The distinction between rational choice and psychotic impulse blurred until it almost didn't matter. Detectives began reconstructing the final moments in the parking lot. Julian's small body had moved instinctively, his mother's hand a shield too weak to stop what was coming. Shoppers froze, some fleeing, some screaming. The chaos was captured in shaky cell phone footage, later replayed in court as an unflinching record of horror. Each frame was a dagger, cutting through the rational mind, leaving only disbelief and sorrow. A twist emerged when one witness claimed they had recognized Bianca in the store earlier, wandering aimlessly and muttering to herself. The timing suggested premeditation, a terrifying calculation that added layers of intent to the already incomprehensible act. Experts argued endlessly, debating whether the randomness of the attack could coexist with these deliberate movements. Each theory felt insufficient, yet essential for understanding, for justice, for closure. As the investigation pushed forward, tensions grew. Media cameras lingered on every step, neighbors whispered suspicions, and Margot became the unwilling symbol of a system that had failed a child. Inside police headquarters, detectives worked late into the night, their eyes bloodshot from footage replayed again and again. The case had transformed from a single horrifying act into a labyrinth of questions about mental illness, societal responsibility, and human vulnerability. By the end of the chapter, one discovery shook the investigation to its core. Bianca had left behind a journal hidden in her apartment, filled with fragmented thoughts, cryptic entries, and sketches that seemed to map her descent into chaos. Investigators knew this document could be the key to understanding her mind, her choices, and the path that had led her to Julian Wood. It was a window into darkness, one that promised both answers and more questions, a final lead that would set the stage for justice. The community braced for what would come next. Every heartbeat echoed with Julian's absence, and every shadow seemed longer, heavier, as though the parking lot itself mourned. The final truth was within reach, but the path to it was fraught with horror, revelation, and the cold, unflinching light of justice that could neither be rushed nor denied. The hidden journal became the center of the investigation, a map of Bianca Ellis's fractured mind. Pages filled with jagged handwriting, sketches of people and places, and rambling thoughts that blurred reality and delusion. Investigators pored over every line, searching for a pattern, a motive, anything that could explain why a young boy had been taken so senselessly. Margot would read the news in silence, clutching Julian's toy to her chest. Each update brought a mix of relief and horror. Relief that the evidence was finally revealing the truth, horror that nothing could undo what had happened. Her grief had hardened into determination. She would see justice served, not only for Julian, but for the system that had let him down. Forensic psychologists testified that Bianca's mind had been a battlefield, torn between delusions and fleeting moments of lucidity. The journal revealed that she had been planning acts of violence for months, though the choice of victims seemed arbitrary even to her. Experts argued that her schizophrenia did not excuse her actions, but rather explained the dangerous combination of impulsivity and obsession that had culminated in the parking lot attack. The courtroom was tense when the trial began. Margot sat in the front row, her hands trembling yet steady, eyes fixed on Bianca. Every flash of the camera, every murmur in the room, brought back the memory of Julian's laughter and his final scream. The prosecution laid out the evidence with precision, detailing the attack, the prior history, and the damning contents of the journal. The knife, the footage, the eyewitness testimonies, all converged into an unshakable narrative of guilt. Bianca remained distant, her face unreadable. The defense argued mental illness, citing schizophrenia and past psychiatric interventions. They painted a picture of a mind beyond control, a person trapped in her own perception of reality. Yet the prosecution countered relentlessly, showing that she had acted with awareness, choosing her moment, her targets, and the deadly instrument. The tension in the room was suffocating. Justice and mercy collided, but for Margot, there could be only one outcome. Each day of the trial brought new revelations. Witnesses recounted the chaos in the parking lot, replaying in their minds the terror, the helplessness, and the screams of Julian. Each testimony reinforced the weight of loss, painting a vivid tableau of a life stolen too soon. Jurors listened in silence, the gravity of the case pressing down like a physical weight. Then came the turning point. A forensic analyst presented new findings from the journal. Bianca had marked a series of dates, including the day of the attack, with precise notes about timing and locations. It was no longer random. It was deliberate. Her mental illness explained her distorted reality, but it did not erase her conscious choice. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. The case, once murky and agonizingly complex, had crystallized into undeniable intent. Margot closed her eyes briefly, imagining Julian's face one last time. In that moment, grief and fury merged. She realized that while nothing could bring her son back, justice could finally take its form. The court proceedings became more than a trial. They were the vessel for truth, the arena where accountability would finally meet consequence. When the verdict was announced, the sound reverberated like a hammer striking stone. Bianca Ellis was found guilty of aggravated murder, felonious assault, and child endangerment. Life in prison without parole. The words echoed in the courtroom, in Margot's mind, in the minds of every witness who had held their breath for months. The judgment was firm, immovable, a tangible statement that some acts, however incomprehensible, cannot go unanswered. For Margot, the sentence brought neither joy nor relief. It brought recognition. Recognition that the system, flawed and fragile, had ultimately delivered truth. Recognition that Julian's life, though brief, mattered beyond the limits of tragedy. She would carry the pain forever, but the scales had been balanced. Outside the courthouse, the community gathered quietly. Flowers were laid where Julian had played. Candles burned in memory, small flickers of light against the darkness that had descended in June. Families embraced, tears mingling with the summer breeze. The horror remained, but so did the proof that justice could emerge from chaos. In her prison cell, Bianca Ellis would live with the consequences she could not escape. The life she had taken, the lives she had shattered, became her constant companions. She could no longer walk the streets, no longer threaten, no longer be a shadow in unsuspecting places. Justice had contained her, and for a moment it seemed as if the world could breathe again. Margot would finally allow herself to step back, to exhale, to imagine a future without the immediate presence of terror. She knew grief would never fully leave, but it had been acknowledged, validated, and weighed against truth. Julian's name would be remembered not only as a victim, but as a life unjustly taken, whose story demanded justice and accountability. And in the quiet aftermath, as North Olmstead streets slowly returned to their familiar rhythm, a single thought lingered. The world had glimpsed true horror, but it had also witnessed courage, resolve, and the power of truth. Justice had been served, accountability had arrived, and Julian Wood, though gone, had left a mark that would never fade. The parking lot where the tragedy occurred remained empty for days, a silent monument to innocence lost. Sunlight reflected off the asphalt, shadows stretching longer than before, and somewhere in the collective memory of a grieving community, a small voice whispered in the wind, reminding everyone that even in the darkest moments, the pursuit of truth could light the way. The story ended not with chaos, but with reckoning, not with despair, but with justice. The final scene lingered, cinematic and unforgiving, leaving the world with one undeniable truth. Actions, no matter how violent or senseless, carry consequences, and the light of justice eventually pierces even the deepest shadows.